All right, folks. It's as I said, it's really an interesting circumstance to be delivering this training this way. We really had great hopes about making this a lot more interactive. We wanted to hear your feedback along the way. We wanted to learn about your questions, to get your ideas and so forth. Unfortunately, we have had to figure this out in the current circumstances and do something a little bit different. So bear with us in the process. We have designed a few polls along the way to at least try to get a little bit of interaction. So I'm going to start with issuing the first poll. And in this one, I'll basically ask you folks a question about how much do you feel that you know currently, right now, about the magnitude of food safety challenges to consumers, producers, and by producers, I mean all the way throughout the supply chain, from farmers all the way to the retailers and sort of the overall economy. Now, of course, Dr. Cannon just gave you some numbers, so that's fine. You can take that into account, what you just learned. But just respond to the following poll to let us know at this point, how much do you feel that you know about this? So let me just switch gears here to issue the poll, and hopefully you will all be able to see it once I launch it. Just a second. Okay, so as you see the poll, read the question and then choose the best answer from these. We'll leave this on a few more seconds. I think about 8 more of you have not responded yet, so hopefully we can. Okay. So I'm going to end the polling and show you folks the results so far. So the question was, when thinking about the effect of food safety issues, I have a pretty good idea about the magnitude of the effect on consumers, food industry, and the economy overall. It's really cool that most of you folks stated that you strongly agree or that you agree with this. In fact, between the two options, it seems like we have, let's see here, about 80% of the folks who either strongly or agree. The other side, we have a few folks who say that they neither agree nor disagree, or that they disagree. Our hope is that by the end of this training today, you'll have a much better understanding, even for those of you that mentioned you strongly agree or you agree, that you'll have a much better understanding once you leave here today. So I know that a lot of you come from the area of food science. As Dr. Karen Cannon said before, we're hoping to give you a social science perspective on this. So let me go ahead and stop the share of the poll, and then I'm going to share my screen once again for my lecture notes. Very good. So before I begin, I would like to tell you folks a story. So I said I'm an applied economist. I sort of live and breathe economics. I really like my field. And so there is this thing that I learned, when I came to graduate school, that some folks refer to economics as the dismal science. And it is supposed to be sort of a derogatory term, but I also think that it's kind of funny in certain situations because it does seem like we're all about, most of the time, about bad news. So let me give you a little bit of a piece of a history on that. It seems like early economists started to think that because they had not observed growth over an extended period of time, meaning centuries and centuries, we didn't observe sort of economic growth, if you will. And so what happened is that they came up with this theory that economic growth is not possible. In other words, we're going to live like our parents lived like their parents or grandparents, or great-grandparents. Everybody's going to have about the same lifestyle, and there is no room for progress, economic progress. Nobody can live sort of a better lifestyle or have more things and have a happier life than the generation before. And And the reason they thought that is because they thought that resources are limited, and we know that resources are limited to this day. And they thought that with those resources, essentially, what happens is that as the population grows, and they might be doing a little bit better. As the population grows, the amount of resources per person is going to shrink. Therefore, it's going to bring sort of bad times. And therefore, then the people will realize that there is sort of no great future ahead of them. They'll start having fewer kids, and then the population will shrink again, and there will be more resource in this case per person. So they start to get a little bit richer. And so as they get richer, they become more optimistic, they have more kids. But again, as the population increases, there are fewer resources per person. And so this goes back and forth in cycles, never allowing sort of humanity to make any progress across history. Well, of course, we are now a living testament to the fact that that is not true, that economists early on, they were wrong about this, because what they didn't take into account is that even with the sort of the limited resources, we can become innovative, we can have technological progress, and we're smart, and we can sort of advance our economies forward even with that limited amount of resources. And so I tell you this story because the numbers that I'm going to show you about food safety, they are in fact very dismal right now. We have a really huge problem with food safety. However, similar to that story where those early economists were wrong that this is a problem that we're stuck with, we'll never have growth. Likewise, I'm of the strong belief that this is not something that we have to sort of accept as the truth of life and go on and sort of just admit it that this is the way it's going to be and it's going to be like this forever. In fact, I'm precisely in this field myself and the other professors who are involved in this project and countless others across the nation. We study this field and we work every day because we do think that these numbers could be reversed for the better if we work, all of us do our part together. So with that said, let me give you folks an overview of what's going on. We already heard that it's estimated that about 1 in 6 Americans get sick each year from a foodborne illness, and about 3,000 people die nationally. Now, I want to emphasize that this number of 1 in 6 Americans getting sick from foodborne illnesses, this is an estimate. Remember that, and as we will talk about in the course of this lecture, and some of you, depending on the field you're in, you might know even better than us, is that not all foodborne illnesses are created equal. While there are cases where the symptoms are really mild and sort of, it's a little bit of discomfort, maybe you lose a day or two of work and a day or two of schooling. In other cases, it might be so severe as to end up with a chronic disease or even death. So what happens is that in those sort of milder circumstances, a lot of people might even go undiagnosed, okay? And so this is a problem that we will chat about throughout the course of this lecture. But keep in mind that this 1 in 6 Americans is an estimate. The annual burden of foodborne illnesses is extremely big. It's extremely big both from the consumer's perspective, it's also extremely big from the producer's perspective, and therefore it has sort of a negative effect overall for the economy. But as most things sort of in economics, this also has some complexities to it. It's not necessarily always a very straightforward story, and I'm going to try today to talk to you about the complexities of that. But before we begin, I just want to mention there are still sort of some, I guess the two main studies that I know of on trying to estimate the overall cost of the foodborne illnesses to all the consumers of the United States, range in estimates from 15 billion, that's an estimate from ERS, to 55.5 billion in a study from 2015. And of course, you might wonder right away, this is a huge range, right? What's going on here? And so it turns out that, again, same as it is very difficult to estimate exact or to come up with a precise number of how many people get affected each year from foodborne illnesses, likewise, it's very, very challenging to estimate very precisely a cost of foodborne illnesses. It turns out just to give you a very brief overview and not go too much into sort of the details that are quite complex in any case. The big difference between these studies is that the second one that basically has a much higher amount takes into account certain things that are extremely difficult to measure, such as quality adjusted life years that are lost, because somebody with a chronic disease, for example, will not have the same lifestyle as they had before the outbreak. Okay, so that's the consumer side, and we will talk a little bit more about this number in the course of this part of the lecture. But the interesting thing is that food safety outbreaks don't just negatively affect consumers, they have enormous effects on the industry. However, nobody has tried to estimate as of just yet exactly sort of how big the burden is to the entire food industry per year. We do have a ton of studies that look at specific outbreaks, and we're going to talk about some of those studies today. So they look at specific outbreaks and how much they cost individual companies or even industries, but not sort of the whole overall industry, starting from farmers all across the supply chain up until retailers and restaurants. Nevertheless, it's in the billions, both for consumers as well as for producers, and therefore it has an enormous effect on the economy as well. Now, a note that I wanted to just make here very briefly, and I'm going to expand a little bit on this later, is that foodborne pathogens predominantly affect certain segments of the population that are already a little bit sort of more disadvantaged, if you will. They have weaker immune systems. It could be children, the elderly, and folks who are already sick with other types of diseases. So it's important to keep this in mind, that it doesn't affect all segments of the population the same, but rather it sort of affects even more those that are already weak, which is an important aspect to keep in mind about this. So let's talk a little bit more about the cost to the industry. So I said before, it's estimated that it's in the billions of dollars, but let's take a look at specifically some of the recalls and how much they cost the respective companies or industries. So by the way, to just sort of give you a side note about this, especially folks who are not in the area of agribusiness and have not studied economics or marketing before, the way economists usually try to capture these costs is by estimating losses, not only due to the fact that the recalled product has to sort of be brought back and destroyed, and so there's a lot of losses associated with that, all the logistics that goes into it, but they also try to estimate how much the sort of the demand will go down due to this outbreak. The loss of the brand reputation, the loss of contracts with other buyers, and so forth. So there are many different losses that the industry can experience. So let's take a look at some of these. In 2006, we had an outbreak of E. coli in bagged spinach. And in that recall, one of the studies that analyzed it, they estimate that the bagged spinach industry lost about $205.8 million during sort of the period immediately following the outbreak. It's thought that the losses are much bigger, sort of if you think about it overall in the course of 1 or 2 years. But in the weeks immediately after the outbreak, the losses are already in the millions. This is due to the decrease, primarily the decrease in demand for bagged spinach. Remember before when I said that the story is not necessarily always straightforward? We will talk about why this is not the whole story. So we cannot conclude. Notice that I didn't say the leafy green industry lost 205.8 million. I said the bagged spinach industry specifically. So we'll talk about how the other segments of that industry were affected. Next, there was another study that looks into an outbreak with listeria in branded ready-to-eat meats. And in that case, they estimated that the sales dropped by 22% during the recall period. And then it took months after the recall to go back to the pre-recall brand market shares. This is an enormous loss, and a lot of the companies will be on the verge of going bankrupt for a situation like this, because this is a very, very significant drop in their sales. Another study looking at post-BSE issues in the beef industry, in the ground beef industry, so sort of from 2003 and on, they find that, so they estimate that in the case of an outbreak in the ground beef industry, in the weeks that follow that outbreak, in the 2-week period following that outbreak, it will cost the whole ground beef industry about a loss of about $96 million. This is pretty significant as well, because you might not be sort of the company that was involved in the recall in the first place, but you're going to suffer the consequences same way. Okay. So now let's talk about risks to consumers. Talk a little bit about producers. Let's talk about risks to consumers. And by the way, right now I'm just covering numbers. Don't worry, we'll talk about sort of how we can, what are the strategies that both consumers and producers can use in order to see if we can reduce these numbers and have better outcomes. Let's talk about from the consumer's perspective. So consuming food is risky, but it's also a life's necessity. And so consumers have to balance that risk with that necessity every single day, several times per day. So food can be contaminated with bacteria, viruses, and mold throughout the supply chain, from the pre-harvest stage all the way to the stage where it reaches retailers and restaurants, and quite honestly, even in our own homes and kitchens and refrigerators and so forth. Foodborne illnesses, as I said before, will range from mild to pretty severe. And in the severest cases, we could see chronic issues. We could see even things like kidney failure, paralysis, seizures, hearing and visual impairments, mental retardation, and in some cases also death. So the consequences to folks just basically by eating food, which is a basic necessity, as I said before, can be very, very detrimental. And so thinking about cost to consumers, we saw that estimate earlier about 15 to 55.5 billion. Where are those costs coming from? They're coming primarily from hospitalization, physician, and pharmaceutical costs. And remember that, you know, as all of you know, healthcare insurance is very expensive in this country. In general, healthcare is very expensive in the United States. So those costs are not negligible for the individual as well as for the society as a whole. In addition, if you end up with a chronic disease, you have to incur those costs over an extended period of time, or probably even a lifetime. In addition to those more direct costs to the consumers from hospitalization expenses, we also will deal with lost income, because individuals, when they get sick, they cannot go to work. Sometimes they have the capability to take a sick leave day, and sometimes they might not, depending on the job that they do. So that might mean lost income for them, especially if the issue persists for a longer period of time. That means that that will lead to even more losses for a longer period of time. And remember when I said that, you know, there is a cost to the economy as a whole. As individuals lose their days of work, it's not just lost income for them, but think about the lack of, you know, the decrease in productivity, if you will, from the company's perspective to wherever they are employed. In addition to that, for most of you that are students, you might face lost school days. And by the way, the lost income and lost school days, these even happen if you don't get as bad as needing to go to the hospital. You might just have 2 or 3 bad days where you're experiencing diarrhea and feeling very, very uncomfortable, right? So those losses can be even for that segment of the population that probably that are never diagnosed with a foodborne illness anyway. And finally, the estimation becomes a lot more complex when we get into things such as quality adjusted life years, the cost of pain and suffering. How do we even go about measuring that? And likewise, how do we measure the cost of human life? We said before, we have about 3,000 lives lost each year, and that number doesn't seem to be decreasing much over time. So that means that, do we want to put a number to that cost of human life? Economists have tried that for other situations as well. So then it brings us into even a sort of a more ethical debate, if you will. How do we then think about putting a price to that? So as you can see, estimating these costs is extremely, extremely complex. And it's not surprising, therefore, that we might end up with very wide ranges depending on how those costs are taken into account and are estimated. So I looked up for data specifically for California, and I was even myself surprised that sort of I knew that it costs a lot, the food industry, by virtue of the fact that California has a very well-developed food industry from the farmer all the way to processors and retailers and so forth. But it also, the numbers are also very significant for the average California consumer. So the average cost per case of diagnosed foodborne illness is about $1,279 on average in California. The average cost per resident, if we take the overall cost of all the consumers who get sick in California and divide that by the total population in California, it's about $192 per year. And then the total cost for the whole state, remember, this is just the losses to consumers. This is an estimate only about the losses to the consumers. It's about $7.35 billion per year. And these costs, as the authors of the study themselves point out, don't even try to tackle certain costs that is really, really difficult to include in such a study, which is, how about the cost to family members who have to take care of you, have to take you to the hospital, stand by you, the cost of their own suffering and distress and so forth. And finally, I've yet to see a really good study that looks into the cost of the public health sector to monitor, to track, and to respond to food safety outbreaks. And likewise, I've not yet seen a cost to sort of the regulatory agencies to set up regulation, to implement regulation, to have inspectors in the field to check out that sort of the industry is abiding by regulation and so forth. So when we think about all of these costs, they are enormous, and that's why this problem is enormous in our society. So I don't want to go too in depth into the communication side because that's Dr. Cannon's area, but just looking at sort of news articles very quickly on a Google News search, you'll see that the recent cases that have happened, especially if you will, in the branded food category, again, I'll talk about sort of that distinction between branded and unbranded later, but by branded food category, I mean things like peanut butter and ice cream and so forth, where brand matters to consumers and to producers. It turns out that now companies involved in food safety cases have to pay for those incidences due to various lawsuits. But what is different in the past few years, I believe in the past decade or so, is that now we're starting to also see cases in which essentially what happens is that executives from companies who were involved in these food safety outbreaks end up basically in prison, and sometimes with very, very drastic sentences. In the two cases that I know of, however, these are sort of more straightforward cases where there seemed to be evidence that executives were in some way informed about the issue and didn't take sort of the necessary steps. Most of the time, the food industry is not evil. They're not trying to make us sick. It's most of the time sort of an honest, not necessarily mistake. It's just something that they never caught and before the food was distributed. So these are very extremely rare cases when the companies were aware, but we need to keep that in mind that there are some cases such as this, and they end up with sort of significant lawsuits such as the ones that we see here. But I strongly encourage you, especially if you're interested in this area, sort of to keep track of what happens. There's pretty much news every day, not just sort of announcing outbreaks that are happening, but also announcing issues like this and how they're resolved. The final question that I want to leave you with in this initial part of my presentation is, now that we sort of have an overview of this issue, of what Dr. Cannon offered you, the timeline, the fact that this doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, that it has been with us for some time, and the fact that these costs to the whole economy are extremely enormous, from the industry to the consumers and even policymakers in the public health sector, I ask you this question and I leave you with this question: whose responsibility is food safety? Is it our responsibility as consumers? Is it the responsibility of the food industry alone? Is it the responsibility of the government to make sure that the food industry abides by regulation and has all the right practices in place? Is it a joint responsibility between certain segments of the population but not others? Or is it all of our responsibility? So as I leave you with this question, we're going to take a brief 5-minute break, and then we're going to switch gears to where Dr. Cannon is going to continue with a little bit more material. I'm going to come back to you sort of in the second part of the training. So stay with us in the meeting. You don't have to leave the meeting. You'll see our cameras go blank for a second, but we'll be with you in about 5 minutes or so. Thank you.